I ended up last time with the with scholasticism, that Thomas Aquinas tried to explain the universe. But anyway, and he tried to reconcile faith with reason, which is something that has proven difficult, especially in modern times. All right. I don't normally emphasize art, but this time I am. This art and architecture. There came about two types of cathedrals. Now we're going to talk in a little bit about a cathedral in Constantinople that was not either one of these. But initially the Romanesque was patterned after Roman, except the Roman cathedrals had stone walls. I mean, the Roman buildings had stone walls, and then they used wood for the roofs. And this could sometimes catch on fire and burn the people below or burn anybody inside. They used wood a lot, and their houses were close together. Well, they eventually learned how to make a roof like a barrel roof. And these roofs were made of stone that were around it. Of course, being made of stone, they were they required very thick walls to support them. And if you know anything about rounded roofs, they are excellent to hold up pretty well and be able to withstand some pretty strong windstorms. But because they had to have strong walls, they didn't have very many windows, so they were dark inside. This was before the invention of the light bulb. And they did have a little bit of glass in them. Now your book shows a picture of these kind of cathedrals. On page 352, the Gothic, the one with a rounded roof, and then the Romanesque, the one with a rounded roof, as opposed to Gothic. Now, the word Gothic has nothing to do with the Goths, so I've been told. Nevertheless, it was called Gothic for whatever reason. They had ribs, and the ribs were spaced apart. But the whole thing about them suggested heaven or skyward. The people of the Middle Ages had a preoccupation with heaven. And they had the tall steeple, the tall tower, which is characteristic of almost every church you see today. So it's church steeple, tall tower. It just seemed to indicate everything pointing skyward. The towers. And they had a lot of stained glass windows, which meant that they were very well lit inside when the sun was shining, natural light. Now, because the windows were stained glass, the interior was lit with multicolored light. So if you'd have gone in, you would not have seen a plain white light like we have here in this room right now, or just plain sunlight. The sun's light would have been shining through stained glass and would have created a multicolor effect. The people of the Middle Ages were great for their mosaics, their stained glass, and they would often use lead to hold the glass together. Now, while I'm on the subject of glass, some of these old cathedrals are still standing, but the glass has an interesting trait to it. The glass is flowing downward. Now, I've been told, when I took chemistry, that scientists were now classifying glass as a liquid because it's known that glass flows. It takes hundreds of years for it to flow very far, to flow noticeably, but it's flowing. And some of these cathedrals that are 1,000 years old, 800 to 900 years old, the stained glass is flowing downward to where the downward part is thick and beginning to cover over the lid that's held it in place. And in some cases, they've gone in and actually replaced the stained glass with new stained glass. And the top of the stain is coming loose again because it's flowing downward. But it takes hundreds of years to notice it. All right. Everybody in the community would work on the Gothic cathedral. Master masons, architects, engineers would design them. Stone masons, other people would get together, and they would take years and years to put together. And folks, there were some cases where a cathedral would get part way up and the whole thing collapsed, and rather than finish the job, they didn't have an easy way to remove the stones. They would just let the pile of rocks just stand there. And sometimes the pile of rocks is still standing there to this day. Particularly when they were building the Romanesque cathedral, when they got to the ceiling, there was a lot of weight. And if somebody misplaced a rock while it was going up, going around and around, if somebody misplaced it, or if somehow the scaffold was not strong enough to hold it until it was temporarily, the scaffold would hold the rocks temporarily in place. If the scaffold was not strong enough, the whole thing would come tumbling down. These kind of construction accidents still happen to this day. You sometimes hear about them. All right, medieval Europe began to overspread the globe somewhat and burst out from their seams. This trend did not continue without some interruption. But the Vikings, and I'd forgotten your book does mention this, the Vikings are known to have gone to Iceland, Greenland, and to Nova Scotia. Now there's all kinds of rumors about Viking colonies being in other places besides Nova Scotia, but the only one that we've actually found is in Nova Scotia. Some man took it on himself to dig it up, find it. It was covered over pretty badly after 800, 900 years, but they found it. The Viking colony in Nova Scotia only lasted about 10 years. And your book says that Europe had problems supporting it. The fact of the matter is they had problems with the Indians. And in the year 1000, the Indians greatly outnumbered the few Vikings who came. And even though the Vikings had steel swords and iron swords and iron helmets and iron armor, the Indians' numbers were more than the Vikings could handle. So the Vikings packed up and left Nova Scotia and went back to Greenland. But then came the Black Death, and for 200 years no Viking crossed the Atlantic. Then when they finally crossed, they found all their colonies were gone. Again, fast forward 500 years, when Europeans came back to the New World, they found, at least in North America, they found the population was greatly diminished. All right. The Crusades. This book, ever since I've taught this course 14 years ago, the book has emphasized the first four. That's standard, folk. The book emphasizes the first four Crusades, but I'm going to emphasize a couple of other Crusade events in a little bit. We think of the Crusades as being an attempt by the Europeans to seize the Holy Land. That was part of it, but also they conducted crusades over here in Spain and Portugal to drive the Muslims out of Spain and Portugal, a process that took something like 800 years. So there were crusades going on where Europe was pushing out on both sides. And now, as I've already mentioned, but it bears repeating, the only crusade that was a military success was the First Crusade. It is sometimes called the People's Crusade because no king went along. It was led by some nobility, Count Raymond of Toulouse and Count Duke Godfrey. A couple of France's high nobility led it. There were 1,000 knights who went along and a whole lot of common ordinary folk. And they were somewhat of a disorganized rabble, but they caught the Muslim world in a state of confusion. They were fighting each other, that is, the Muslims. And the Crusaders wound up driving the Muslims, at least temporarily, out of the Holy Land, out of Palestine and Syria. Now, the emperor of the Byzantine emperor, when he requested that the Pope send him help, when the Crusaders arrived, he insisted that they should conquer in his name, that they were conquering him, and the Crusaders spoiled right away and said, no, we're conquering for ourselves. The Crusaders then set up a kingdom, and the map of the kingdoms they set up is showed on page 354. They actually set up 4 kingdoms, don't bother memorizing them, but the main one was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Edessa. No, only Jerusalem was a king, but they had principalities and a dukedom and a count. One duke, one count, one prince, and one king. To this day, folk, I have to throw this in. The king of Spain claims the title of King of Jerusalem because he says that his ancestors were given that title, and the title has been passed down from father to son for about 800 years. And he claims that he's king of Jerusalem, but he can't make good that claim. Anyway, the Crusaders were promised forgiveness for sins, instant release from purgatory, release from any chance of going to hell if they participated. The ones who'd been kicked out of the church were immediately restored. The criminals were let out of prison. But the Pope relied more on the trained knights than he did the common people who he was afraid would not know how to fight. And so it was. Anyway, the First Crusade was a success. Several years after the First Crusade, they decided that the Muslims were getting restless, and the kingdoms that had been set up in the Holy Land began to get in trouble. So Europe called the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade was a failure. I've already mentioned how it was led by Louis VII of France, and they thought it would go somewhere because a king was involved. However, the king took his wife, and she took 50 women along, and these women did not stay in their place, you might say. But, I mean, that's putting it mildly. And make a long story short, when the crusade failed badly, the king, his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the other crusaders went home, having not accomplished much. Even though they still had the kingdom of Jerusalem, but the Second Crusade did not, at least they didn't lose any territory. But in the meantime, between the Second and Third Crusades, Saladin took over. Saladin made news in my lifetime. Saddam Hussein was an admirer of his, and he claimed to be descended from Saladin. He almost acted like he was Saladin reincarnated, but he claimed to be descended from Nebuchadnezzar and Saladin. And folk, he might have been. I mean, I've told you how that probably every Iraqi living today is descended from Nebuchadnezzar. Again, and probably almost every Iraqi living today is probably descended from Saladin. Again, Saladin goes back, what, 900 years. So anyway, he probably was. But anyway, the Third Crusade met Saladin, but a couple of things went wrong with the Crusaders. They had three kings involved. King Richard the Lion-Hearted, King Philip Augustus of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick was drowned trying to cross the river. I believe he was trying to cross the river in heavy army, and he drowned. So much for him, and when he drowned, his army turned around and went home. Philip Augustus stayed a while. When the going got rough, Philip turned around and went back home. If they could have stayed together, folk, who knows what they might have accomplished. As it was up to Richard to try to handle the Saladin. Richard lost, but Richard at least made a treaty with Saladin where Saladin promised that the Crusaders could, probably the Europeans could at least visit the holy places in the Holy Land. The birth of Jesus, the empty tomb, the place of the crucifixion. He allowed the Europeans to visit. And then Saladin died. The popes knew that they could not conquer the Holy Land as long as Saladin were alive. So when Saladin died, the Pope called another crusade, the infamous Fourth Crusade. Now, the Fourth Crusade, instead of going to the Holy Land, it wound up going to Constantinople. They had a disagreement with the emperor, and they sacked Constantinople and occupied Constantinople and drove the government of Constantinople out of the city. The government remained in exile for some 50 years, and finally 50 years later, the people of the Byzantine Empire were able to return and take their city back from the what was left of the Crusaders. But this did irreparable damage to the Byzantine Empire. the Byzantine Empire never recovered. Now, it was to be another couple hundred years before the Byzantine Empire was finally conquered, but the Byzantines never fully recovered from the Fourth Crusade. All right, now something I must mention about all these crusades. Your book mentions it. They all turned against the Jews. Particularly felt like, hey, what is the glory in fighting the Muslims, which they called them infidels. What's the glory in fighting the infidels when we're having infidels living right here among us? And they're Christ's enemies. So they turned on the Jews. And folk, this may sound horrible, but they would gather, say, to surround the Jewish community, set the community on fire, and while the people inside were screaming and dying, the crusade would be raising her hands toward heaven, praising God hilariously, thanking God that they could have such a part in the great work of God's kingdom. And this was their mindset, folks, not mine. And in no way do I intend to call for any form of anti-Semitism. But nevertheless, I have to mention, because it's important, the people here at this time were strongly anti-Semitic, and they became more so as time went on. Not only did they become anti-Semitic during the Crusades, but then when the Crusades were over and the Black Death hit, Jewish people did not seem to perish from the Black Death as much as the general population, and this made the people of Europe hate the Jews even more. The Jews were driven out, were strongly driven out of this area of England, of Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, and England. In 1290, the King of England at that time kicked the Jews out. Now, earlier kings had brought the Jews in. All right, I'll tell you why. The kings felt like the Jews were a sponge, and they would soak up all the money in the economy, and then every once in a while it became necessary for the king to squeeze it out of them. Then put them back in the economy, they'd soak up the money again. I mean, this was their opinion at the time. Again, not necessarily mine. Not all Jews were rich. But finally, in 1290, the king expelled them. Well, the Jews wound up congregating here in Germany and Poland and Russia, and they could not know, but they were setting themselves up for the Holocaust of the 1940s. But they began, because this part of Europe at the time did not persecute them as hard as these parts of Europe down here that are between Europe and the Holy Land. I guess that had something to do with it. So they congregated up here, setting themselves up, and of all the pogroms, the word pogrom means an attack on Jews. Of all the pogroms Europe had, none was worse than the one that occurred in the 20th century. And folk, anti-Semitism is still a 21st century phenomenon. The issue has not gone away.